The family home, a place of love, nurture and provision, where characters are developed and our love for Jesus begins. An empowered home is where family members belong, learn about God and His never-ending love for us. An empowered home is where our core values are cultivated and reflect a life of service and contribution. An empowered home is where faith development takes hold. It's not about preaching for hours at our children, but to use life lessons as a way to teach Christian principles. It's not about banging our children over the head with Bible rules and regulations, but a way to be intentional and affirming in a simple way. It's not about organising an overwhelming schedule, but making simple changes to the normal routines of home. Imagine how much your children will grow with you and with God when they are connected spiritually at morning time, when incidental and informal conversation happens as you walk to school or sit in the car together, during focused discussion and the day's reflection at mealtime, storytelling and intimate conversations that connect with the child's heart at bedtime. Having regular, prayerful and intentional habits at home will change a child's life forever. Having daily rituals create beautiful memories that last a lifetime. The kingdom is truly present when the family comes together. How are we as a church empowering homes? How can we support the role of parents in our congregations? What do we do that enhances marriages? And what resources do we provide for at-home faith development?
If the worship coordinator were to call you during the week and ask you to be involved in the worship service that coming Sabbath, what would you hope they would ask you to do? Would you like to be on the sound desk, make announcements, preach, do the children's story, lead out in the main prayer, lead out in the singing or in the music? Would you like to be greeting people and welcoming them when they first come in, reading the scripture reading? There are so many different ways we can contribute as adults, and yet somehow in so many churches we limit what our children are allowed to be involved in to singing up the front on 13th Sabbath. They come in, they're cute, they're apparently involved. Our job is done, right? I would like to challenge you on that thought. In their book, Children's Ministries in the Way of Jesus, Ivy Beckworth and David Sinos write, to participate in the life of the faith community, children need to be a part of this community. And to be a part of the community, they need to be present for its central practices. They need to rub shoulders with all sorts of folks who make up this community. They need to be seen as active and valued members of their faith community. This means we need to be intentional about allowing children to be a part of the church community. We need to welcome children into intergenerational worship, not just having different generations at your church, but allowing each generation to participate in a meaningful way. We need to ensure that they participate using their gifts and feel that they belong. We need to give children equal opportunity to contribute and have a voice. We need to guide and mentor them to participate in meaningful ways, recognising that it's not just adults who have gifts to share. God has given our children talents that need to be nurtured and cultivated. They can't do this by observing. In fact, if this is all they do, they probably won't stay. They need to be learning and growing and fully involved in the everyday happenings of church life.
God created us for relationship with Him and relationship with others. Research has proven that the relationships a child has with adults during their formative years are integral to their development and overall well-being. But they are also an important key to just who that child will become as an adult. How we treat children actually changes who they are and how they develop. So, how do we cultivate authentic relationships with children and young people? We can start by getting to know their names and then greeting them personally. Ask how their week has been. How was school or work? And take time to really listen. which are their favourite subjects at school and the ones they like least. Find out about their interests and spend some time learning something about those things yourself so you have a talking point. There's a great opportunity here for you to become the learner and let them teach you. Be excited and amazed about their worlds and their journeys of discovery. Be sure to remember the significant events in our children's lives and celebrate with them. Birthdays, school events, exams, graduations. A card or a text message is a tangible reminder that they are important to you. Pray for them and tell them that you're doing so. And as you do this, you will have opportunities to speak into their lives, words and actions that bring hope, encouragement, love and support. Walk beside children and young people who are learning to serve. They are watching you and looking for cues that show them how to act. Encourage them when they attempt new things and delight with them as you watch their baby steps become a confident walk. To have an authentic relationship with a child means we need to be intentional, honest, and vulnerable. We need to be real. Children are very quick to spot a fake, but they also warm to those who genuinely care about them. And you know, even kids won't care what you know until they know that you genuinely care about them. You may never know until eternity the full impact that taking time to really care about a child has had.
In January 2015, over 8,000 young people gathered together for the South Pacific Division Pathfinder Camporee. This was a noteworthy experience, a memory event that no one who went to that would ever forget. These experiences are so important in the development of a young person's faith. Think back to when you were young. What were the memory experiences that you remember that formed foundational memories that built your faith? I recently asked my daughter what she remembered growing up. What were some of the things that made a difference? And she said to me, "Dad, I remember you." And I said, "Well, elaborate a little bit." She said, "I remember when we went for chips." And I remember I took her out on a daddy-daughter date. We went to Nando's and I remember sitting across the table from her and she looked up at me with these loving eyes. "Daddy, I love having chips with you." It was just something so simple, yet it formed such an important milestone in her development. And I remember sitting there with her and praying with her, and that really just formed an amazing faith experience. It's important for us to develop opportunities for our kids and our young people to have these noteworthy experiences. Research shows that noteworthy memory events are a key factor in developing faith in our young people. There's two real ways that we can do this. Firstly, we can connect to noteworthy events that are happening that other people are organising. Maybe it's our local church or our conference. Things like Pathfinder Camporees or camps or Big Camp. Getting our young people involved with these events is a great way to form foundational experiences and memories. Summer camps are perfect in this avenue. The other way to do it is to develop them ourselves, just as a family, and it can be something just as simple as taking a walk at the beach. Young people need these memory events, the things that they remember as being times where God is connected to them and they look back and never forget.
What does it mean to encounter God? You know, we can provide the best programs, we can provide the best material, the best Sabbath schools and the best pathfinders and adventurers, and they're all great. But unless somewhere in that process our children get to encounter God for themselves, it won't stick. And our job is to create sticky faith. That's why we have Faith Shaper, to create sticky faith. And with God encounters, our children need to encounter God for themselves. Things like when you run Sabbath school, don't just tell the story. Ask the why questions. Allow the children's silence to contemplate what this means for them. And maybe God will speak to them. Pray with them and encourage them to pray and encounter God for themselves. Most of all, get them involved in activities and events where they can find God for themselves. Take them out in nature, God's second book, is a way that children can encounter God in the silence. So often, our children are so connected to their iPhones and their iGadgets, but they are so busy with that white noise that they never find time in the silence to hear God speak to them. So create times where children can disconnect so that they can connect with God, both at church and at home. Taking children on Pathfinder camping experiences or some of those great memory events are great ways on those high experiences where they can encounter God. Maybe it's through music, maybe it's through story, maybe it's through object lessons. Provide that rich experience knowing that each child will encounter God for themselves. The most important thing is to show your children how God works for you. And then your story will become their story. Today we're going to talk about the 10 buzzwords in children's ministries. You know, as I travel, as I read, as I go to conferences, as I go to churches, as I mull over what's happening, there are 10 things that stand out that are happening in children's ministries that, if put in place and done well, will grow our kids and keep our kids into church. I'm married. I have 2 children, a wife and 2 children, and they're my first ministry. You know, if I get to heaven and here's Pastor Darren, who's been children's ministries and the Balloon Man, and I've travelled around all over the South Pacific talking to children, and if I get to heaven and there's all these children there, that's fantastic. But if my 2 aren't there, I would see my ministry as a total failure. My first ministry is to my children. So I'm selfish in what I do in some ways because I want to get to heaven and have my 2 there. So my belief is if we can put in place some buzzwords, I call them, some factors that will grow our children's ministries both at church and at home, it's going to help us to disciple our kids and to stand there with them on that day when Jesus comes again. So let's go through these 10 buzzwords and see what you think, but also think as you do them, how you apply this in your church and how you apply it in your home. Buzzword number 1 is intergenerational communities, or I like to call it messy togetherness. You know, during the 1900s, developmental theory came on the scene. People like Erikson and Piaget looked at ages and stages that all people go through as they go through life. And Fowler came along, James Fowler, and put in place some faith stages on top of this. It was really awesome, really great. But in so doing, while this might be great for education, when it came to the church, we divided our children and our ministries to youth and to teens and to young adults. We divided so that we could specialise. There's nothing wrong with that in some ways, but if our families go to church and never get together, then we have a problem. Cara Powell and Chap Clark, in their book Sticky Faith, said that intergenerational togetherness in worship is the stickiest that you can get in passing on faith to your children. That is, where mum and dad and grandma and grandpa and uncles and aunties and mentors all rub shoulders together in intergenerational worship. It's in that worship that the children see mum and dad putting money into the offering, standing for the hymns, reading their Bibles, kneeling to pray, and they see their mentors around them doing the same thing. And in so doing, faith becomes sticky. It seeps into their bones. So intergenerational community or messy togetherness is crucial if we're going to pass on faith to our children and disciple them. Number 2 of our 10 buzzwords is conversational theology. What I mean by that is, so often think we can disciple our children by taking them through a deductional Bible study of our fundamentals, of the beliefs of the church. And whilst that is important, children don't do their theology or don't do their fundamentals in those deductional classes. They pick up their theology, they pick up their beliefs in the journey, along the way. We think of Jesus. He walked with his disciples and they were discipled as they journeyed and as they observed him in his journey. Conversational theology. When you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. That's where theology happens. So if we're going to disciple our children, it's more important that we engage in conversation, engaging wrestling with the questions, than in actual teaching. The teaching is in conversation. So the question is, I guess, how can you journey with the children in your sphere of influence? And what does that look like for you? Engage in the journey. Engage in the conversation along the way, and we'll disciple our children. Buzzword number 3 is relational webs, or what I call mentoring. Mentoring is probably one of the most significant things that we can do to disciple our children. I'm here today as a pastor, as a children's ministries pastor, because of the people in my church, in my community, that mentored me. I could tell you story after story about my kindergarten teacher in kindergarten Sabbath school, my school teacher in grade 5 who walked with me and talked with me. I'll tell you about the school chaplain, Rob Robe, who didn't just tell great stories, I'm sure he did, I don't remember them, but he played soccer with me on the oval and my friends in recess and lunchtime. I could tell you about my uncle, who was a head deacon. I must have annoyed him. I followed him around the church and opened the windows and put out the communion bowls and collected the offering, stacked the chairs. He never told me to go away. I could tell you about person after person in my faith community who mentored me, and one day, when I was a 9-10-year-old, I saw how Jesus worked for them, and I thought it might work for me too. My journey, my testimony, is people who invested in me. Here's the thing. Research says if we can put 5 mentors into the life of our children who know them by name, who affirm them, who are there for them, not so much an intentional mentoring program, but the ad hoc rubbing of shoulders type of thing that happens in our communities. 5 mentors in the life of our children. Those children are more than likely to adopt the faith of those mentors. I can do that as a dad. I can find those 5 people to invest in my children, and I know you can too. Number 4 in our buzzwords is story. Storying is huge when it comes to passing on faith to our children. Amanda Honts-Drury wrote a book called Saying is Believing. And in her research, she said our children won't know what they believe till they can voice what they believe. Testimony, storytelling, sharing how faith works for them. Stories are important in our young children's lives. I like to call the twilight zone, the bedtime time, where we can sit down with our children or lie in the bed alongside them and read them a story or tell them a story. Children need to know 5 layers of stories in order to be discipled. You know, the stories of the Bible, the grand narrative of how Jesus and God have stepped into Earth's history and what that looks like. The grand narrative of Scripture. They need to know the stories of the church universal. How did the church form? Those early people in our church. Also the great stories that we have. Florence Nightingale and George Mueller and those missionaries that went out and were pioneers for the word. Tell those stories. Number 3, in those stories of your church denominational. Why are we an Adventist church? How did we form? And what are the stories? You know, I'm here because every Friday night growing up, we'll sit around mum and dad's bed. 6 children, the smallest one in the bed and the rest of us, piece of the doona covering us, and we'd all sit around and mum would read. And often they were those pioneer stories of the Adventist church. You know, the angel did say Australia. And as mum read those stories, I heard the angel calling me as well. Their story became my story. And they need to also hear the stories of the church local. Where do you attend? How was your local church planted? What are the stories of people of faith in your local church community? But most importantly, they need to know your story. Why are you a Christian? Why are you an Adventist Christian? And where has God come through for you in the good times, but more importantly, in the not so good times? Children need to hear those stories. Sarah Arthur says that stories give our children the weapons they need to defeat the dragons. And the dragons are real. They're out there. So here's my challenge. Don't moralise. Tell stories. Read stories. Tell your story. And disciple your children. Number 5 in our 10 buzzwords is rites and rituals. You know, rituals are significant. We all have rituals. When we get up, when we go to work, when we lie down and eat and all those things. And it's in those rituals that faith gets passed on. Our getting ready for Sabbath rituals, our Sabbath day rituals, our family holidays and the things that we do. They're all rituals. And you know, Deuteronomy chapter 6 and Romans chapter 12, read it in the Message. The Message edition, it really says it well. It says, take your everyday stuff that you do and offer it as a living sacrifice to God. As children participate and observe those rituals, the faith seeps into their bones. In fact, a famous Jewish rabbi said, without ritual, there is no passing on of faith. That's challenging. What are the rituals and the rites that you're involved in? Rites. How do we celebrate the rites and the milestones that our children go through? When I was a young teenager and I turned 13, I knew I'd become a man. You know why? I was given the book, Everything a Teenage Boy Should Know, classic Adventist book. I was also, though, given a tomahawk, and I went out and chopped down my first tree. Now today, that's not a good thing, but back then, that's what I did. I was given a sheath knife, water on my belt, went out and caught my first rabbit and skun it. Bit gruesome. But I knew that I had become a man. I knew I was good enough to become a man. Now here's the challenge. What rites and rituals are we engaging our children in? Those mundane habits that we as families and churches engage in, how are we passing on faith through those rites and rituals? How are we letting our children know they're good enough to be a man, to be a woman. They're good enough for God because He loves them so much. That's the message our children need to hear. Participation is number 6 in our children's ministries buzzwords. So often we think that discipling children is pouring things into them where the adults need to teach them, the adults need to tell them, the adults need to be up the front while the children sit there and soak it in. Well, let me tell you, that's not discipleship. While children need to be taught, while we do need to teach them the things of the faith, they need to participate. They need to be involved. In fact, when it comes to authentic discipleship, it is a two-way street. Children can disciple us as much as we disciple them. It happens along the way. And so if we want to truly disciple our children, they need to participate. They need to be involved. They need to be up the front, involved in presenting worship and presenting programs and presenting ministry, be just as involved as the adults are. When this two-way street of discipleship occurs, that's when children begin to realise church belongs to them as well. And if children feel like they belong, then they're going to want to stay and never want to leave. So my question to you today is, how do the children participate in all you do in your church? Number 7 in our children's ministries buzzwords is immersion in service and mission. What the research is finding very clearly, especially done by Diana Garland, Inside Out Families, what she discovered and others are discovering is that when our children are involved in worship and involved in serving, both in worship and in the community with their families, exponential spiritual growth occurs in our children. So often we want to lock our children away in the Adventist bubble. In a community that I know well, we can be born in an Adventist hospital. We can go to an Adventist preschool. We can go to an Adventist primary school. We can go to an Adventist high school. We can then graduate from high school and go to an Adventist college, then graduate and be employed in an Adventist institution and spend our whole working lives working in the church. Then when we retire, we can retire to an Adventist retirement village. Then we can go into an Adventist hostel. And even then, when we finish at the hostel, we can be buried in an Adventist cemetery. Nothing wrong with that. I'm an Adventist and I love serving in my church. But if our children never get the chance to step outside the Adventist bubble and experience the community around them for themselves and be involved in that community, in serving others, they will never understand what it means to be a Christian. We need to get our children outside the Christian ghetto and let them see what Christianity is all about with our shirt sleeves rolled up in the gutters, in the streets, in the marketplace, serving others. Because service to others really does matter. Involve our children in service and we'll disciple them. Number 8 in our 10 buzzwords in children's ministries is faithful parents. Vern Bengtsson spent his whole life studying generations. And he looked at how faith is passed from generation to generation to generation. And he's just published his work. And what he found for us is both good news and bad news. What he found was that children are more likely to adopt the faith that they see in their parents. But it's not the faith they see on the 7th day when we dress up all churchy, and when we dust off our Bibles and go to church, and yeah, that's awesome, that's good. But they're more likely to adopt the faith they see in our seventh-day living. Now, for me as a dad, that's a bit scary. Because children are watching how I treat my wife when no one is watching. They're watching how I act when the chips are down. Had a hard day at the office and things are going wrong, I feel like throwing it in. How does God work then? They're watching in how I even treat my children. Do I, as a dad, have the intestinal fortitude to say sorry to my children when I get things wrong? To show grace in my parenting? You see, that's the 24/7 faith that they're looking for and are more likely to adopt. So, Mum, how are you demonstrating your love for God? How are you showing your children what it looks like to be a faithful disciple in all that you do? And dads, so often we can get so busy in wanting to leave a legacy, house and car and a heritage, nothing wrong with that. But the most significant legacy that we can leave for our children is an authentic 24/7 faith. That takes time, investing time in our families. So dads, mums, be faithful. Show your kids what a 24/7 faith looks like. Number 9 in our 10 buzzwords of children's ministries is parenting in the pew. Robbie Castleman wrote an awesome book about it. It's just been updated. Get a copy. But parenting in the pew is all about having our children present with us when we worship. You see, so often we want to send our children out the back and so we can listen to the sermon. But the kingdom of heaven is truly present when all the congregation assembles together for family worship. So church member, mum or dad, if you find your senses being overwhelmed by having children present in our worship services, there's a cry room just for you. Take yourself out the back, have a cry, compose yourself, and come back in and join in the community worship where all of God's kingdom comes together. You see, children need to be present in the pew because as they watch and observe, it seeps into their bones. So let's support our parents. Let's welcome our parents. Let's know that when a baby is screaming at the top of their lungs in our worship services, that the kingdom of heaven is truly present. You know, if I don't hear a baby crying, I know the church is dying. Let's help our parents to parent in the pew. And we'll learn from them. They'll learn from us. And together, we will celebrate God's kingdom. Number 10 in our buzzwords is identity. You know, identity is something that's tossed about in our schools and communities that we need to make sure that our children understand who they are and what they believe and have a strong self-identity. The best way for identity to form and for beliefs to form is to see it lived out in the life of the people in their faith community. They want to know where the rubber meets the road. They want to know how the faith gets up and walks, how our 28 fundamental beliefs get up and walk in our daily lives. Unless they make a difference, they're not going to sink in. And so for Adventist identity to be formed in our children, needs to be formed in the deep relationships. A recent study I was reading said that our children adopt 100-year-old identities when they listen to the stories of their grandparents. You know, when you read the biblical text, we often don't think about the grandparents, but grandparents have a significant role to play in passing on faith and values and stories to our children. Grandparents have a divine right to spoil our grandkids and send them home. And so mums and dads, grandmas and grandpas, mentors, form those deep relationships, tell those stories, and show our children what a religious identity and Adventist religious identity looks like. That's how we form identity in our children. Live it, tell it, show it, and they will never want to leave.
So relational children's ministries. Seems a little bit obvious, doesn't it? It's almost like we should do a session on why the sky is blue. Having a relational children's ministry is just makes sense, doesn't it? If you think back to some of the people that were influential in your upbringing, people that led you to Christ, just think about them for a moment. Chances are they probably had people that led them to Christ. In fact, if we found the people that led them to Christ, there was probably people that led them to Christ, right back to where Jesus gave the disciples the original commission to go and make disciples. And that wave has carried from generation to generation right down to us today, and now we have the privilege and responsibility for taking that great commission and going and making more disciples. There's an alarming statistic in our church that 50% of our kids will end up leaving. Now, I don't know about you, but I sure wouldn't want to line up one of my kids, flip a coin to see whether they'd stay in the church or not. This statistic has to change. Sad thing is, if we keep doing the same thing, we're going to get the same results. Significant relationships are going to make the difference. Research from Value Genesis shows that the more mentors that we can bring into the lives of our young people, the more significant that impact is on their lives. In fact, if we're able to get 5 mentors into the lives of these kids, chances are that they will stay in the church. It's important for us to understand that children go through several phases of development as they're growing up. When we think of the little kids, the beginners, the kindies, everything is brand new. Sensory input is so important. Their attention span is also quite limited. So songs, stories, crafts, little activities make such a difference in the way that they experience faith. As they become older, they begin to use language more effectively. When we think of our primary kids, they're starting to interact and to explore and discover the Bible for themselves. And when we look at juniors and teens, they are becoming independent learners and independent Christians of their own. It's critical that we lay the foundation right at the beginning to see our kids grow to become fully healthy, functional Christians. There are several phases of spiritual development that kids go through. In the early phases, a foundation is laid, and pretty much Christianity is given to them. They listen to the stories, they sing the songs. But as they grow in that journey, they become to discover it for themselves. They become Bible explorers, reading the Bible for the first time. I remember my 7-year-old came home the other day and he was excited because his homework was to read Mark chapter 5. And he sat down in his Bible and he read through it, discovering it for himself. The next phase of Christianity is so important. It's the phase of spiritual ownership. Once kids reach around the junior age group, they start to choose faith for themselves. They start to see it as something they want for themselves rather than just going to church because their parents take them along. And the final stage of Christian development is leadership. We want to see our kids progress through these different phases to reach their full Christian potential and become Christian leaders of their own.
Did you know that 50,000 young people are leaving the Christian church in Australia every year? That means 700 young people are leaving the church every single week. So if you're a parent and you have 4 children and you are a follower of Jesus, according to these statistics, 2 of your children will not continue in the Christian faith. This would be devastating. But you know what? We have a solution for you that will support you in the shaping of faith of your family. It is called Faith Shaper. It is not another program. It is not a quick fix. Faith Shaper is a collection of faith experiences that a child needs to be involved in or experience to ensure that they have a rock-solid faith. Shaping the faith of your child happens in collaboration with an empowered home, a loving church, and a service-orientated school. Your child's faith and love for Jesus will grow in strength as you intentionally prioritize shaping their faith. May God bless you as you do this.
Have you ever had one of those days when you just can't get a catchy or annoying song out of your head? Was there ever a time when you watched a movie and couldn't get a certain image out of your head? These are examples of how your memory can retain things by sound or sight. Now think about how hard it was for you to tie your shoelaces once upon a time. Chances are that's not a great struggle for you anymore. Your brain has learned muscle or kinesthetic memory for tying shoelaces. There are 3 main types of learning methods, and most people have a preferred method. The 3 types are auditory, which is using your sense of hearing, visual, which is your sense of sight, and kinesthetic, which is movement. Studies show that 20 to 30% of people are auditory, 40% are visual, and the remaining 30 to 40% are kinesthetic learners. For auditory learners, they enjoy hearing the information. They enjoy music, which will often mean they're humming or singing to themselves while they work. They don't necessarily do well with written directions, partly because they probably won't read them properly. They like to brainstorm and discuss information together. They also like to discuss the main ideas at the end of the time together. So what kinds of things could you do in Sabbath School to help these learners learn best? You could have students repeat key words or phrases in your lesson so that they can hear themselves saying parts of your story or lesson. Use an appropriate song to reinforce what you've just taught, or even interrupt your lesson to sing it. This is also a great way to pull your class back if you're losing them. You could also have your students close their eyes and just listen to a portion of the story. For example, as you're teaching the story of the Tower of Babel, you could have the children close their eyes and bang the floor with their hands or feet to simulate the sounds of thousands of people leaving Babel. This will also help your kinesthetic learners. Earlier in the story, you could have children listen to the sound of 2 bricks grinding together as you talk about building the tower. If you give verbal instructions to visual learners, they might find them difficult to follow. This is because their minds will sometimes stray during the instructions. By showing them a picture or visual, it will help them to remember much more easily. Visual learners often like to read and notice the details where others may not. They may be the more quiet kids in your group. To engage visual learners, show them lots of vivid colours and pictures. Find some great Bible illustrations, either in a picture Bible or online. Use a computer or iPad to display pictures, or print them out and hold them up as you speak. Felts are another really great way to use visuals and are becoming a much more popular option again. The GraceLink movie is also a great way to engage visual learners in a Sabbath School lesson. For abstract concepts, try magazine pictures. You might also try a physical object that will help your kids visualise what you're teaching. If you're a visual learner, it's often the object lessons that will be embedded in your memory. If you have taught for any length of time, you know there are some kids that just seem like they're always moving. Well, it might be important for them to learn and sit to listen like the other kids. Keep in mind that they learn best through movement because these are your kinesthetic learners. These kids will be the ones who are likely to touch you when they talk. They come alive when they're engaged in activities and like to solve problems by actually working through them. They are the ones who are most willing to try new things. These learners are your hands-on kids. If you're teaching the Tower of Babel, you could let them feel some bricks or let them build the tower out of Play-Doh or blocks. When teaching the story of Noah, have the children build houses and other objects out of Lego. Then take them outside onto some steps and dump huge pots of water down on them to simulate flooding the earth. Perhaps the simplest way to engage kinesthetic learners in your lesson is to have them perform the actions from the story as you teach it. This works best with younger children. If someone rides a horse in the story, have them stand up and pretend to ride a horse. If someone is hauling a heavy weight, have your students pretend to do that as well. If you have never looked at your own learning style, I would strongly encourage you to do so. There are many online quizzes you can take to look at what your preferred learning style is. In fact, I would encourage you to pause this video and take a test right now. This will make a lot more sense to you if you do. The reason this is so important is that when we teach Sabbath school or in any other area, we often rely heavily on our own learning style, as this is what we feel most comfortable with. However, the kids we are teaching aren't necessarily going to match our learning style. This means that we need to use a variety of methods to engage the children in your class. Imagine that you are teaching a Sabbath school class using the story of the lost sheep. If you just told the story, no matter how well you used your voice and how dramatic you made it seem, you would really only be appealing to the auditory learners. The visual and kinesthetic learners would walk away having gained very little. If you told the story using some pictures or props to illustrate along the way, both the auditory and visual learners will be engaged. If, however, you gave children the opportunity to look for the lost sheep as you told the story with props and expressive storytelling, you have engaged all of your learners in a lesson they will be excited to share with their parents as they leave your room. Imagine if after every lesson you taught the kids, they walked away saying, "We came, we saw, we heard, we touched." Then they'll be able to say, "We conquered." The Bible teaches us that knowing Scripture is important and valuable. It can help us through all sorts of difficult situations, such as being hurt, scared, or alone. It can also help us praise and worship God through any situation, good or bad. Being able to recall Bible verses to mind is a powerful tool. Even Jesus used Scripture to stand up to Satan when he was being tempted in the desert. And this tool is just as important for kids as it is for adults. Children are like sponges. Because of the development of the brain, it is actually much easier for kids to learn new things than adults. And yet we often underestimate their abilities and brush over the importance of learning their memory verse each week. There are some simple and effective ways that you can help children learn Bible verses, either in Sabbath school or in the home, that will help them to store the information in their long-term memory rather than just their short-term memory. The most important thing to remember when teaching a new verse is that unless it has meaning and context, the verse will be very difficult to recall at an appropriate time. The memory verse needs to be explained and unpacked so that there is a full understanding of what it is saying to us and also how it can be used in everyday living. Anytime you put information in a song, it is much easier to remember. I can still recall songs that I learnt in Sabbath school as a young child. This is a great way for children to memorize a Bible verse. It can be a tune that is made up or one that is well known. For children who are a bit older, they could even make up their own songs. Using muscle power is another great way of helping children memorize verses. You can march around the room saying a verse, beating a rhythm while saying the verse. Also helps to store the information. Often in the GraceLink lesson, particularly in the kindy lessons, there are actions to do while saying the memory verse. Any time you connect movement and routines to information, it accesses a memory pathway. One of the most effective ways to help children to memorize verses is to associate them with an emotion. Imagine getting students to understand the fear that Joshua felt being given the responsibility of looking after all the Israelites after Moses died. They then learn the verse, Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. The verse then has context, meaning and emotion to help kids store it in their long-term memory for a time when they are afraid and need encouragement. Once the verse has been looked at, ask children to draw a picture to show how they could apply that lesson into their own lives that week. Learning memory verses is an important and valuable tool that we can equip children with by giving them strategies to store these verses in their long-term memory rather than simply repeating them in Sabbath school. This can only happen effectively when children understand the verse and how to apply it in their own lives in a meaningful way. As adults, we are well aware of the amazing power of prayer. We know that having an active and meaningful prayer life helps to develop a deeper friendship with Jesus. And we want our children to have that friendship too. We want them to know that they can talk to Jesus about anything and everything. They can pray for forgiveness, wisdom, courage, or peace. As it says in Ephesians 6:18, they can pray on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. We are well aware of the power of prayer. And yet, have you ever been in a small group or a small group setting where someone has been asked to pray? All of a sudden, there is something remarkably interesting out the window or a piece of lint on your clothing that just won't come off. Often, for adults, praying in public can be an uncomfortable thing. And yet, we are surprised when, especially as kids get older, they start to feel uncomfortable praying in public too. We want to empower them with the understanding of how important praying is. We also want to give them skills and make them feel comfortable so that just like anything else that's practiced, it becomes a normal part of everyday life. There are some very simple ways that children can be encouraged to feel comfortable when asked to pray in our Sabbath school classrooms. One way that is fun for all ages is to give them a bit of Play-Doh each and ask them to think of something they are thankful for that week. You can then ask them to share what that thing is with the class so they get to name it first. Then a simple thank you sentence prayer can be said around the class. In all the times I've done this, I've never had one child refuse to pray. Another fun one is a Smarties or M&M prayer. Give each child a couple of Smarties or M&Ms. Give each colour a topic. For example, red might be family, green might be nature. They can then say a prayer using each colour as a prompt for something to say. A great one for children who have had very little experience with prayer is to write prayers on small pieces of paper and then hide them around the room. The kids can then do a treasure hunt to find the prayers and then use the one they have for their prayer time. If children are younger and can't yet read, pictures are a great alternative. The idea is to give children specific things to pray for to take away any fear or embarrassment they might feel. As they grow to feel more comfortable praying, they will learn how to develop their own personal and meaningful prayer life with Jesus.
Relationships are hard, and in our lives there remains two truths. We have a centered place of wisdom, harmony, and strength. We are never going to be in that place all the time. The reality is we are all part of one another's lives in a beautiful yet profound way. This means that our lives affect others from the way we treat others, drive on the road, and interact on a day-to-day basis. We cannot be anything other than being in relationship. God in all his wisdom made us to be in community, interacting with each other. He also created us as emotional and creative beings, made to be connected with him and to connect to others. In the Bible book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 2 to 8, it says that there is a right time for everything on the earth. A right time to cry and another to laugh. A right time to lament and another to cheer. A right time to embrace and another to part. A right time to hold on and another to let go. A right time to rip out and another to mend. A right time to shut up and another time to speak up. Sometimes as Christians, we think we need to put on a happy face despite our brokenness and our pain. Being a follower of Jesus doesn't mean our lives are going to be perfect. Rather, that in our times of sadness and anger, that God is with us. It still means we feel our emotions and are not immune to pain or the ability to feel. The problem is when we dwell on our emotions, when we do not seek to heal from it, it is incredibly unhealthy for us to carry this burden with us for the duration of our lives. Our lives are shortened, less happy, less satisfying, and we go from surviving to thriving with Jesus. When we sit with our emotions, name them and move on, life is better, more abundant and beautiful. Who doesn't want that? So it's important that we understand our emotions first. Questions first. How do you acknowledge your emotions? Is there time in your day that you put aside for prayer and reflection? Do you have a journal and spend time each day writing down your feelings, prayers, and maybe even acknowledging 3 things that you are grateful for? Maybe life goals or prayers. I'd like you to consider that for a moment. When it comes to our children, it is so crucial that we acknowledge their feelings. If we trivialise their feelings or punish the child for showing any emotion, they will grow to learn that their emotions cannot be trusted and that there is something inherently wrong with them. If they don't learn to regulate their emotions, they have trouble concentrating, forming friendships, and getting along with other children. When a parent values the child's negative emotions, there is an opportunity for intimacy. If a parent can tolerate spending time with a sad, angry, or fearful child, a child will have time to work through their own emotions. If a parent sees the world of negative emotions as an important arena for parenting, the child will learn to trust their feelings, regulate their own emotions, and solve problems. They will have high self-esteem, learn well, and get along well with others. John Gottman, writer of Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child, says that researchers have found that even more than IQ, which is your intelligence quotient, your emotional awareness and ability to handle feelings will determine your success and happiness in all walks of life, including family relationships. Empathy is the key ingredient to emotional coaching. It is when we acknowledge that a child cannot be happy all the time and need to understand their emotions, to be able to name their emotions and sit comfortably with that. Emotion before moving on. It is in creating an understanding environment that this comes into play. Imagine a home where instead of constant cheerfulness, your family's primary goal was empathetic understanding. A place where children would feel their parents were there for them no matter what. A place where they could turn for support because there would be a place of understanding and a bit of an understanding of what was happening inside of them. As empathetic parents, when we see our children in tears, we can imagine ourselves in their position and feel their pain. Watching our children stamp their feet in anger, we can feel their frustration and rage. This is empathy. To become a great emotional coach for your child, there are 5 steps. The first step is being aware of the child's emotion, putting yourself in the child's shoes. It's amazing the power of simply saying, "It sounds like you're upset," which gives the child something to go from. Children have reasons for their emotions, whether they can articulate those reasons or not. The second step is recognising children's negative emotions as opportunities for bonding and teaching. It's good for a parent to understand that a child needs their parents most when they are sad or angry or afraid. The ability to help soothe an upset child can be what makes us feel most like parents. By acknowledging our children's emotions, we are helping them to self-soothe. These skills will be there for a lifetime. Remember, we can't ignore those negative feelings and hope that they will go away. Emotions don't work that way. Feelings do disappear when they are spoken of, when they're labelled and when they're felt. If your child learns that you are their ally, you can figure out feelings together. The third step is listening empathetically and validating the child's feelings. This is the most important step in the emotional coaching business. This requires all your senses. Use your eyes to watch for physical evidence. Use your imagination to see the situation from the child's perspective. Use your words to reflect back in a soothing, non-critical way what they are hearing and help label the child's emotions. Use your heart to feel what the child is feeling. Remember to take the time that it needs. The fourth step is to help label the child's emotions as they are having them. It is so easy and yet so important. This transforms uncomfortable feelings into something definable, something that has boundaries and is a normal part of everyday life. The act of labelling the emotion has a soothing effect on the nervous system, which helps children to recover more quickly. Kids who can calm themselves from an early age are more likely to concentrate better, have better peer relationships, higher academic achievement and good health. It helps to develop their vocabulary and help for them to define that perhaps that they are feeling more than one emotion, and that is normal too. The fifth and final step of being a great emotional coach is setting limits while helping the child to problem solve. Once you have spent time with your child and helped them to label and understand their emotions, the natural step is the process of problem solving. This step is a little more technical, but stay with me, it's worth your while. First of all, you need to set limits. Let's start with inappropriate behaviour. After a parent acknowledges the emotion behind the misbehaviour and helps the child to label it, the parent can make sure the child understands that certain behaviours are inappropriate and cannot be tolerated. Then the child can be guided into ways of thinking of more appropriate behaviour to handle the negative feelings. Feelings aren't the problem, the behaviour is. We next need to identify goals. Once a parent has listened empathetically to the child, labelled feelings and set limits, the next step is usually to identify goals around the problem solving. If it doesn't feel like the logical next step, make sure your child has had time to express their feelings. Empathise and label, ask open questions. Ask your child what they would like to see change next time. But sometimes there's not a solution. Perhaps their dog has passed away, a friend is moving to another school, or they didn't make the team. In these cases, your child's goal may simply be to accept loss or find comfort. I'd like you next to think of possible solutions. With your child, come up with options for solving the problem. Try to encourage your child to do this themselves and try one idea at a time. Role-playing or fantasy play is a good way to practice. With older kids, encourage them to try a whole bunch of ideas and let them know that there's no such thing as a bad idea. Evaluating. This is your time to go over all your ideas and decide which ones to eliminate. Is this solution fair? Will this solution work? Is this safe? How am I likely to feel? How are others likely to feel? Now it's time to help your child. Once you and your child have explored the possible outcomes, encourage them to try one of their ideas, share personal stories of your childhood, let your child learn from their mistakes, encourage them and move on. This all may seem overwhelming at first, but with practice becomes automatic and can be done quickly. Remember, you want problem solving to be brief but often. If you guide your child through the steps, don't be surprised if, with experience, they learn to take the lead and begin problem solving on their own. While the steps of emotional coaching don't take very long, especially as you and your child become expert emotional coaches, there are times when the process has to be postponed at a later time. This process works best when it happens one-on-one. In real life, we don't always have time to handle an emotional situation when it happens. Other times you may consider delaying the 5 steps when there isn't privacy to talk the matter through, when you or your child are too upset or too tired, when you need to address serious misbehaviour, and when the child is faking. Whatever you do, don't put off the emotional coaching for too long. Coming back to the problem means that you care. One matter that I'd like to share is the importance of fathers in the process of emotional coaching. When dads are part of the emotional coaching, it makes a significant difference to the child. Research, no matter where I find it, says that while a mother spends more time with the child, the contact with the father figure is so much more intense, therefore significant. Where possible, ensure that fathers or father figures are part of the emotional development of every child. This is too important not to share with you. Following are some examples that you might like to try with a friend or partner. You may even like to try this out today with one of your children. The results are powerful. The examples below are situations that I've had to deal with in my home with my young 2 boys. I thought you might enjoy some private, awkward moments in my home so that you can learn from my mistakes. Finally, I'd like to add that these 5 steps aren't only for children. These same steps can be used in relationships, marriages, even in friendships and in the work environment. Stephen Covey, in his best-selling book, The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, highlights the importance of seeking to understand and then to be understood. Imagine the power of empathy in every situation or conflict that comes your way.
Recently, a book came across my desk that really made me sit up and listen and read it, of course. The book is called Growing Young by Cara Powell, Jake Mulder and Brad Griffin. What was of interest was that this book is research that has studied churches and looked at what keeps churches growing young and staying young. As I travel around churches, I see some that are doing really well and some not so well when it comes to keeping our kids. And stats say we're losing between 50 and in some cases 90% of the children who grow up in our church from our pews. And that worries me. I wonder, what does it take to grow young as a church? Let's look at 6 core commitments that the study found keeps churches growing young. Core commitment number 1 is to unlock key chain leadership. What the study found was that churches that grow young and stay young handed over the keys, literally and metaphorically, to the children. They involved them in their programs. They gave them keys to the building and let them have a part in the program. If children feel like they belong, and young people, then they'll want to stay. So how are you unlocking key chain leadership in your church and passing on the keys to the next generation. Core commitment number 2 is to have empathy for our young people and to realise where they are at. Our young people are asking the question, who am I? Identity. Where do I fit in? Belonging. And what difference do I make? Purpose. And I believe that a growing young church can offer the answers to these 3 questions in really significant ways. The best way to do that is to mentor our young people, to be there in their space, to huddle with them, to know their name, and to just walk the journey with them. If we could invest significant adults into the life of our young people, then their sense of belonging, their sense of identity, their sense of purpose grows within them. And they will seize their destiny, their mission, God's mission, and take the journey onwards. Number 3 in the 6 core commitments is to take Jesus' message seriously. So often we want to water down the message, we want to make it easy, we want to make it relevant. We take the meat out of the message. And our kids want to know the true cost of discipleship. So tell the story. Don't moralise. Wrestle with the hard questions. We don't need to know all the answers. We just need to wrestle with it. And if our children and young people learn the cost of following Jesus, they want something that they can commit to, be proud of, and be involved in. And Jesus' message and mission is all about it. So take it seriously. Don't hold back. Tell it as it is. Number 4 in our 6 core commitments is to fuel a warm community. Sometimes we get so busy trying to make our worship programs contemporary and relevant and hip and cool that we lose sight of what it means to be authentic. And authentic churches that grow young fuel a warm community. That comes in creating intergenerational moments throughout our churches where all the generations come together, where we can be together in socials and in worship and in our service activities, where the children and the young people rub shoulders with the adults. So the question is, how are you fueling genuine warmth for the children and young people in your church? Number 5 in our 6 core commitments is to prioritise young people and children everywhere. The book describes this as the hinge point of churches that continue to grow young, is that they prioritise young people and children everywhere, in everything they do. Imagine in your board meetings, as you're considering budget and dollars and program and mission, that every decision you made, you ask the question, how does this prioritise our children and our families? Churches that grow young ask that question repeatedly. Whatever you do, make sure that children and families are number 1, and your church will continue to grow young. Number 6 in our 6 core commitment is to be a good neighbour. Churches that are good neighbours in their communities ask the question, if we were to disappear tomorrow, would the surrounding community notice that? If the answer is no, they won't notice, then we need to think about what it means to be good neighbours in our community. How can we serve in our surrounding community until the people ask why? Look at the life of Jesus. Most of his life was spent with his shirt sleeves rolled up in the gutter, mingling with the people, healing them, helping them. And then he said, "Come and follow me." And so churches that grow young serve until it hurts. Serve until people ask why. This is the type of church that our young people want to be a part of. Involve them in service and they'll never want to leave.